We can't pretend you're still part of this family. Daniel, not after what you've done, my father's voice rang out across the banquet hall, cutting through the clink of silverware and the soft hum of the hired jazz trio. And for a moment the sound seemed to hang in the air before dropping like a stone, silencing 200 guests who turned in unison to look at me. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I read everyone. My name is Daniel Ross. I'm 38 years old, and I was born and raised right here in Ohio, in a small suburb outside Dayton called Kettering, where the winters can be bitter enough to freeze the Miami River into jagged plates, and the summers smell like cut grass, asphalt, and backyard grills. I own a small but thriving logistics software company headquartered in Columbus, a business I built from scratch after more than a decade of grinding through graveyard shifts, long commutes, and a series of jobs that chewed up my 20s, and in the last 5 years, it's taken off enough that I've been able to give my employees better benefits than most Fortune 500 companies, while finally giving myself a life that doesn't revolve around scraping to make rent. But if you'd asked me before that night whether my parents were proud of me, I would have said yes without hesitation. After all, I'd been the one to help them keep their house during the foreclosure scare of 2012. I paid for my sister's nursing degree when her student loans fell through. I quietly covered more than one family medical bill when insurance didn't pick up the slack. And I never once asked for a penny back, not because I expected a parade for it, but because I thought that's what family did. The banquet was supposed to be a celebration of my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, something I'd helped organize by booking the venue, paying for the catering, and even covering hotel rooms for some of the out-of-town guests. But in the weeks leading up to it, there had been a shift in their tone toward me, subtle at first. Shorter phone calls, fewer texts returned, a strangely evasive edge when I asked about the schedule for the event. My mother in particular had been curt, her warmth replaced with something brittle, and when I asked if something was wrong, she would insist she was just busy with preparations, and then change the subject. Looking back now, the signs were there, but I brushed them off because I didn't believe my own family could be that cruel. Not after everything we'd been through together. The day of the banquet started innocently enough. It was a muggy August Saturday, the air thick with the smell of recent rain, and I drove down from Columbus in my black Tesla Model S, suit jacket, hanging in the back seat so it wouldn't wrinkle. I arrived early to check in with the event manager, making sure the AV setup was ready for the slideshow of old family photos I'd spent hours digitizing and sequencing to music. I shook hands with cousins I hadn't seen in years, accepted hugs from aunts who smelled like perfume brands I remembered from childhood, and watched the room fill with a mix of laughter, clinking glasses, and the sound of the band warming up in the corner. My sister, Allison, arrived around 6 with her husband, Trevor, and our parents. She gave me a quick nod, but Trevor avoided my eyes. I didn't think much of it. He's always been awkward with me. But my father's handshake was oddly limp, his smile tight, and my mother barely made contact at all. As the evening went on, I noticed little clusters forming, people leaning in close to whisper before glancing at me, and while I'm not paranoid by nature, the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Still, I pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on making sure everyone had what they needed, checking that the wine was flowing, the buffet stayed replenished, and the slideshow queued up properly. Then, just after dessert was served, miniature cheesecakes, lemon tarts, and chocolate mousse cups, my father tapped a butter knife against his glass, drawing the room's attention with a theatrical pause that made me think he was about to tell one of his long-winded stories about meeting Mom at a county fair in '82. But instead, he launched straight into the announcement. "We can't pretend you're still part of this family, Daniel, not after what you've done." He didn't shout, but his voice carried with the crisp authority he'd honed in decades of managerial jobs, the kind of tone that leaves no room for rebuttal. My mother stepped forward slightly, her hand resting on his arm as though she were steadying him, but her gaze locked on me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. "He's chosen a path that prioritizes money and personal gain over loyalty and tradition," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "And while we wish him the best, we cannot have someone in our lives who refuses to meet us halfway when it matters." A few guests exchanged awkward glances. Others sat frozen, eyes darting between my parents and me. My cousin Evan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but didn't look at me directly. The air felt thick, the cloying sweetness of the dessert table suddenly oppressive. I could feel the heat rising in my face, but I didn't say anything. I didn't even move. The silence that followed was like a void, filled only by the faint clatter of a fork somewhere in the back. Then, as if on cue, a smattering of hesitant claps began, not from everyone, but enough to make the moment feel both final and absurd. I wanted to ask what the hell they were talking about, but I already knew. 2 months earlier, my parents had come to me about co-signing on a second mortgage for a business opportunity my father had been offered by a friend from church. When I asked for details, it turned out to be a speculative real estate flip in Florida, run by a man with a history of bankruptcies and lawsuits, and the whole thing reeked of risk. I told them no, not angrily, not judgmentally, just no, explaining that I couldn't jeopardize my company's stability or my employees' livelihoods for a gamble. They'd been visibly disappointed, but I thought they understood. Apparently not. Now it was clear they had taken my refusal as a personal betrayal, and instead of talking to me, they decided to stage this public execution of my character. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Allison. You should have just done what they asked. Now look what you've done. No sympathy, no concern, just accusation. Another buzz. Trevor, might want to head home. People are talking. Inside, the banquet was winding down. Through the glass doors, I could see guests shaking my parents' hands, offering condolences as though I'd died. The jazz trio was packing up, the clink of glassware faint against the muffled murmur of voices. I could have gone back in, demanded answers, made a scene, but what good would that have done? I've learned that some battles aren't worth fighting in the moment, not because you're weak, but because you're thinking 3 moves ahead. And I knew, standing there in the heavy August air with the sound of the interstate in the distance, that this wasn't the end of the story. They'd chosen humiliation as their weapon. Mine would be time, patience, and precision. It's strange how silence can feel louder than any accusation, how the absence of calls, texts, or casual invitations can press in on you like an invisible wall, and in the weeks after the banquet, that wall became my constant companion. Not sudden and dramatic, but built brick by brick, each layer added by a missed call that was never returned, an email that got no reply, or a family group chat that seemed to carry on without me. Its photos and inside jokes continuing like I'd never been part of it, and while I wasn't naive enough to think my parents' little spectacle had gone unnoticed, I underestimated the speed with which it would travel. How quickly a sentence uttered over miniature cheesecakes in a rented banquet hall could make its way into the coffee shops and church parking lots of Kettering, whispered over paper cups of burnt gas station coffee, then carried on to Facebook posts from old neighbors who phrased their gossip like concern, each one beginning with, I don't know the whole story, but... Before launching into speculation about what I'd done to deserve being cut out, and by the time the 3rd week rolled around, I could feel the edges of my reputation fraying in places I hadn't even thought about. The barber I'd gone to for years suddenly too busy to fit me in, an old high school friend canceling our lunch at the last minute with a vague "things are crazy right now" text. Even the local printer I'd used for promotional materials for my company shifting his tone to something clipped and overly formal, as if afraid to be too friendly in case it reflected badly on him. My employees, to their credit, didn't treat me any differently, at least not outwardly. The Columbus office was far enough removed from my family's social circle that most of them hadn't heard about it, though I caught the occasional glance from my operations manager, Jenna, when I lingered too long staring out the window during our Monday meetings, the faintest flicker of curiosity in her eyes before she buried herself back in the weekly report. Still, I kept my work sharp, sharper than ever, in fact, because one thing I refused to give my parents, my sister, or anyone else was the satisfaction of watching me spiral. I'd been through worse storms than this, though never one that came from inside the walls I thought were meant to protect me, and if there's one thing I learned in the long climb from those graveyard shifts to running a company, it's that survival isn't about outrunning the fire. It's about letting it burn where it wants to while you quietly move the things that matter out of its path. So I kept moving, even when the burn reached places I hadn't expected, like the night Allison called out of the blue, her number flashing on my phone just as I was locking up the office. I stood there in the darkened hallway, debating whether to let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was cool, almost businesslike. You should know Dad's telling people you're not welcome at Thanksgiving this year, she said, no preamble, as though she were calling to inform me about a canceled dentist appointment. I figured you'd rather hear it from me than be blindsided. There was no apology in her tone, no hint of regret, just the delivery of information, stripped of emotion, and before I could respond, she added, It's for the best. Things are tense. I wanted to ask her when she decided my exile was for the best, or whether she'd bothered to defend me in any of these conversations, but I knew the answers already. Thanks for letting me know, I said instead, my voice even, and she seemed almost relieved I hadn't pressed further. Take care of yourself, Daniel, she said, then hung up. I drove home that night with the city lights blurring in my peripheral vision, my hands loose on the wheel, and somewhere between the freeway on-ramp and my exit, the first threads of an idea began to weave themselves together. Not a plan exactly, not yet, but the outline of something patient and precise, the kind of thing that would require months, maybe years, to take shape, because revenge, if it's going to work, can't look like revenge from the outside. It has to look like something inevitable, something they brought on themselves without ever realizing you were steering them toward it. That thought stayed with me through the rest of the year, through the quiet Thanksgiving I spent alone in my apartment with a bottle of Pinot and a ribeye. I grilled on the balcony. The December nights when I drove past houses strung with Christmas lights and remembered how, in my family, the holiday season always meant at least one evening spent drinking cocoa in the living room, swapping gifts in front of the fire, a tradition that I assumed carried on without me, though I never saw photos, never got so much as a Merry Christmas text from my parents. I threw myself into work, expanding the company's client base into 3 new states by the end of the first quarter, negotiating deals that kept me on the road just enough to avoid running into anyone from home, and when I wasn't traveling, I was reading everything from corporate law to estate planning to obscure case studies on succession disputes in family-owned businesses, not because any of it directly applied to my life at that moment, but because I knew that if I was going to take anything from them, it would have to be something they couldn't get back, something that hit them not just in the wallet, but in the structure of their lives, the scaffolding they'd built their little empire on. The opportunity came into focus one evening in late March, when I got a call from an old friend of my father's. Not someone I'd ever been particularly close to, but a man named Hal Wilcox, who ran a mid-sized manufacturing outfit in Dayton and had, over the years, crossed paths with my father through various business groups. He was calling, he said, because he'd heard I was doing well for myself in Columbus and thought I might be interested in an investment opportunity. I almost laughed at the symmetry of it. Here was another too-good-to-be-true pitch from another man with ties to my father, but something in Hal's voice made me listen instead. It wasn't a scam, at least not in the traditional sense. He was looking for a buyer, quietly, for a small but profitable warehouse property he owned outright, and he wanted to sell it before the end of the fiscal year. Your dad's been sniffing around about it, Hal admitted, but between you and me, I don't think he can swing it without taking on a lot of debt. That was the moment the threads in my head began knotting into something solid. I arranged a meeting the next day, drove down to Dayton, and toured the property, a nondescript but strategically located space on the edge of the industrial district, close enough to the interstate to make logistics a dream. By the time I left, I knew I was going to buy it, and not because I needed it for my business. I'd bought it because I knew my father wanted it, and I knew why it was the missing piece for that same speculative real estate scheme I'd refused to bankroll months earlier, the project that had been the spark for my public exile. I didn't gloat, didn't broadcast the purchase, didn't so much as hint to anyone that I'd outmaneuvered him. I simply signed the papers, transferred the funds, and waited. Patience, after all, was the weapon I'd chosen that night outside the banquet hall, and patience meant letting them walk straight into the wall I was building. Over the next few months, I heard through the grapevine that my father had made an offer on the property, only to be told it had already been sold to a private buyer, and while I couldn't be sure, I imagined the look on his face when he learned the buyer was me. He didn't call, of course, neither did my mother or Allison. But small signs of strain began to surface in their public lives. My father, once a fixture at local business association meetings, stopped attending so regularly. My mother's Facebook posts shifted from photos of smiling family gatherings to vague, inspirational quotes about resilience and letting go of grudges. I didn't celebrate these changes, not outwardly. I just kept moving pieces into place, acquiring things they wanted or needed, quietly positioning myself so that when the moment came I could decide whether to grant or withhold them. And I knew, deep down, that the real strike hadn't happened yet. The warehouse was just the first move. The rest would come when the time was right, and when it did, they wouldn't be able to say I'd done anything to them at all. They'd just see the consequences of the choices they'd made, standing there like a mirror they couldn't look away from. By summer, The silence between us had hardened into something almost physical, a kind of invisible no man's land that stretched between my life in Columbus and their world in Kettering, and though I never crossed it, I found myself watching it from a distance, the way you might watch a storm building on the horizon, knowing it would eventually drift your way, the only question being when. But the thing about storms is that they follow their own timing, and in the meantime, I kept building, adding to my company's reach, making acquisitions that on paper looked like smart and personal business moves, but in reality were quietly, deliberately strategic in ways only I understood. Like the day I closed on a small chain of independent trucking depots in Southwest Ohio. Depots my father's real estate group had been negotiating to lease for over a year, according to a mutual contact who didn't think twice about mentioning it over coffee. And I didn't correct him when he assumed my interest was purely about optimizing delivery routes for my logistics software clients. In truth, I had no immediate use for those depots, but I knew that controlling them would force any buyer in that area, including my father, to come to me sooner or later, and control was the currency I was stockpiling now, quietly, without the fanfare of revenge, but with the precision of someone stacking pieces on a chessboard. Each move designed to look harmless until the moment they weren't. It was in early August, almost exactly a year after the banquet, when the first ripple hit my father's side of the line, small enough that most people wouldn't have noticed, but I knew the shape of it instantly. A property deal he'd been touting to his church friends as a sure thing suddenly collapsed when one of the key parcels was pulled off the market without warning, and while I had nothing to do with that particular move, it was a reminder that timing mattered as much as intent, that sometimes the universe lends you a hand if you're patient enough to wait for it. The real opening came 2 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon, when I got a call from an estate lawyer in Dayton who'd been referred to me through a mutual business acquaintance. He was representing the heirs of a recently deceased local magnate, the kind of old money figure who'd quietly owned half the commercial real estate in the county, and one of the properties they were liquidating was a cluster of retail spaces in downtown Kettering, spaces that, I learned within 5 minutes of looking at the file, included the corner lot where my mother had been dreaming of opening her own boutique for years. I knew this not because she'd told me, she never had, but because Allison had once mentioned it in passing during a family cookout, years before all this, when Mom had been sketching store layouts on the back of napkins, talking about someday like it was just around the corner. I went to see the property the next day, walking its creaking hardwood floors, noting the way the late morning light pooled in the front windows, and by the time I left, I'd made up my mind. I'd bought the entire block under a holding company, keeping my name out of the public filings, and then, just to make sure the opportunity looked genuine, I had my property manager put up a for-lease sign with a number that routed to one of my office assistants in Columbus. 3 weeks later, my assistant told me a woman had called about the space, said she'd been looking for the right spot for her shop for years, and when he asked for her name, she said it was Linda Ross. He played dumb, took down her information, and told her they'd be reviewing applicants in the coming months. We never called her back. I didn't take pleasure in it. Not exactly. But there was a cold satisfaction in knowing that the dream she'd nurtured quietly for so long now sat behind a locked door I controlled, the key in my pocket. Around that same time, Allison and Trevor hit a rough patch that spilled into public view, the kind of marital trouble you can't entirely hide, no matter how many smiling Instagram posts you try to post over it, and while I didn't involve myself directly, I did notice that some of the financial strain they were under seemed tied to a stalled renovation project Trevor had taken on, a project that, according to the building permits, required materials supplied by one of the very trucking depots I now owned. I didn't raise prices. I simply made sure my clients with larger, more profitable contracts got priority, and somehow his deliveries always seemed to get pushed back just far enough to keep him behind schedule. The beauty of moves like these was that they were deniable, indistinguishable from bad luck or market forces, and in public I was nothing but polite when our paths crossed, which happened twice in that period, once at a mutual friend's birthday party, where Allison avoided me almost entirely, and once at the grocery store, where my mother, standing by the produce section with a cart full of apples, looked at me with something halfway between surprise and disdain before muttering a curt "Daniel" and moving on. Each time, I let them walk away without pressing for conversation, because the distance served me better than confrontation ever could. Distance meant they couldn't accuse me of anything without revealing more than they wanted to, and it gave me room to keep building the conditions for the real checkmate I'd been envisioning since that night in the banquet hall. The final piece came into view late that winter, when I learned, again through the casual gossip of the local business community, that my father's real estate group had overextended itself, locking up too much capital in a project that wasn't generating returns, and they were in the early stages of seeking bridge financing to cover their obligations. The lender they approached was a private investment fund based in Cincinnati, one I'd quietly bought into years earlier when my own business started generating serious surplus, and while I wasn't a majority owner, my stake was large enough that my input on certain deals carried weight. The decision on whether to extend that financing would come down to a closed-door vote among the partners, and I already knew which way mine would go. I didn't argue against the loan, that would have drawn suspicion, but I did raise quiet, reasonable concerns about the risk profile, about the group's liquidity and the volatility of the market, and when the vote was tallied, the financing was declined by a narrow margin. I never told them I'd been in the room where that decision was made. Never let slip that I'd had a hand in closing off what might have been their last easy lifeline, because this was never about gloating or delivering some cinematic reveal. It was about control, about watching the slow, inevitable consequences of the choices they'd made take shape around them like a cage they couldn't see until it was closed. And as winter turned to spring, I began to see the first signs that they were starting to feel it. Small changes in posture, in the way their names appeared less often in the society pages, in the way Allison's texts to old friends became less about brunch plans and more about job leads. The thing about patience is that when you finally reach the point where the board is set exactly how you want it, you don't have to move loudly. You just have to make the next move inevitable. It happened. When it finally happened, with none of the drama my parents would have expected from a reckoning, no slammed doors or raised voices or public confrontations, just a steady, unbroken sequence of events that began on a humid Thursday morning in late June, when a notice appeared in the public records section of the county clerk's office announcing that Ross and Pritchard Real Estate Holdings, my father's firm, had defaulted on one of its largest commercial loans, and though I hadn't engineered the default itself, I had spent the better part of 2 years ensuring that every time they reached for stability, they came up with air, quietly tightening the bottlenecks around their revenue streams, acquiring properties they needed for expansion, buying up suppliers they depended on, and closing off avenues for financing that might have bought them time, so that when this moment came, it arrived not as a sudden catastrophe, but as the final, predictable collapse of a structure that had been hollowed from the inside. I read the notice online while sitting in my office in Columbus, the blinds drawn against the early heat, my coffee still steaming on the desk, and I felt no rush of adrenaline, no triumphant grin, just the deep, steady satisfaction of knowing that every insult, every whispered comment, every deliberate exclusion they'd thrown my way since the banquet had been answered in full and in kind without my ever having to step into their arena. Within days, word spread through the Kettering business community that the firm was seeking to liquidate several of its holdings to cover debts, and I didn't have to wonder which properties would end up on the block. I knew the portfolio as well as my father did by then, knew which assets were over-leveraged, which had sentimental value, and which could be pried loose with the right bid at the right moment. Through a network of shell companies and third-party buyers, I acquired 3 of them in as many weeks. Not just any 3, but the ones I knew would cut the deepest, the office building they'd operated out of for over a decade, the warehouse property that had been meant to anchor his Florida project before I'd taken the keystone from under it, and most personally, the small strip mall where my mother's favorite boutique location had been, the one she'd once dreamed of making her own before I quietly took it off the market. I kept the acquisitions quiet at first, letting the transfers process and the dust settle before making any moves, but eventually, the changes became visible. The Ross and Pritchard sign came down from the office building, replaced with the clean, modern lettering of a regional tech company I'd leased it to. The warehouse was renovated into a fulfillment center for one of my newer ventures. The strip mall was given a facelift and new tenants, its rent rates adjusted just high enough that my mother could never justify them, even if she tried. By the end of the summer, my father's firm had been reduced to a skeleton operation, its name still on paper but its influence gone, and with it went the public stature they'd always valued more than they'd admit. It was around then that Allison called me, not with the clipped, transactional tone she'd used the last time, but with a thin layer of something like desperation beneath her words. She said Trevor had taken a job out of state and she was considering moving with him, that things had been really hard lately and she didn't know where else to turn. She didn't apologize for the text she'd sent me after the banquet, didn't acknowledge the role she'd played in all of it, but the subtext was clear enough. She was asking for help without saying the word. I told her I hoped things worked out for her, kept my tone even and polite, and when she hesitated as though expecting more, I let the silence do the rest. Not long after, I ran into my mother in the parking lot of a grocery store, her hair pulled back, her clothes neat but tired looking, and for the first time since that night, she didn't look at me with disdain. She looked at me like someone who had just remembered something they'd lost but couldn't name. She started to say my name, then stopped, and I simply nodded and kept walking. My father, for his part, never reached out, though I heard through mutual contacts that he'd taken a consulting job with a much smaller firm in Dayton, a far cry from the empire he'd tried to build. I didn't gloat, didn't circulate the story, didn't need to. The people who needed to know already did, and the rest didn't matter. My revenge, if you could call it that, wasn't about spectacle. It was about balance, about returning the weight they'd put on my shoulders to theirs in a way they could neither deny nor escape. And yet, even in the quiet satisfaction of it, there was no joy, only the steady knowledge that I had kept my promise to myself from that night outside the banquet hall, that I had answered humiliation with patience, exclusion with control, and betrayal with the kind of precision that leaves no fingerprints. In the fall, nearly 2 years to the day after the banquet, I stood outside the office building that had once been theirs, now bustling with the employees of its new tenant, and I thought about how quickly fortunes turn, how reputations built over decades can dissolve in months, and how the people who had once been so certain of their power over you can find themselves navigating a world where you are the one holding the keys. I didn't think about reconciliation because some fractures aren't meant to be repaired. I thought about the quiet symmetry of the arc, the way every move I'd made had led here without ever needing a single shouted word or public scene. And as I walked back to my car, the air cool with the first hint of winter, I realized that the truest form of revenge isn't about making them hurt the way they made you hurt. It's about making them live with the knowledge that they no longer have any say in your life, that the power they once wielded is gone, and that the only role left for them now is to watch from a distance as you go on without them, stronger than they ever imagined you could be. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.